All right, so what is next and what happens if Russia does in fact invade Ukraine? We're joined now by Michael de Groot. He's a assistant professor at the International Studies at IU Bloomington. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, many of us have a tendency to ignore events happening on the other side of the world. So tell us why this matters to folks right here in Indiana. Of course, our military could get involved, but why else does what happens in Ukraine matter to us?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I think you ask a fundamental question. I think it's important to stress that the likelihood that American forces would be directly involved is quite low. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and therefore the United States and its NATO allies are under no obligation to protect it. But nevertheless, I do think that it threatens American interests and values for a variety of reasons. First, it broadly threatens a U.S. international order based on self-determination, the rule of law. And a Russian invasion of Ukraine could set a very bad precedent of changing international borders by force. And it could empower revisionists, such as China and its problems over Taiwan. It would also force the United States, I think, to pay a lot more attention and money to European security. It would become a lot more expensive to protect NATO allies at a time when Washington wants to shift resources to trying to contain China. And more concretely, I think there can be significant economic problems at home. A war would inevitably upset the financial markets, which can disrupt the global economic recovery.
Well, we've seen the president of Ukraine telling the people there to just go about their own business. So is there fear in Ukraine that Russia is going to go through with this and invade, or do Ukrainians think Putin is just saber rattling to get attention?
I think there's a combination of both. And that comes from the simple fact that nobody, and I think there's a good case to be made that Putin himself isn't quite sure what he's going to do. The timeline of this crisis, I think, is very different for Ukrainians than it is for those of us in the United States. And there's a simple reality that Ukrainians have been dealing with the possibility of a widespread Russian invasion since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea and is engaged in an undeclared war in the eastern part of Ukraine known as the Donbass. It was also a very recent buildup of Russian forces just this past spring. So this is something that they've had to deal with and have had to try to find some degree of normalcy. I will say, though, that I think that one of the unanticipated byproducts of this crisis it has helped crystallize a Ukrainian sense of identity, one that I think more aligns with Western values of democratic capitalism than it does with Russian authoritarianism.
You mentioned the Russian buildup. It seems that Russia does have a superior military edge over Ukraine. From a military standpoint, if Russia does invade, would this be a rather, I hate to say easy effort, but I'm going to say that. Would it be an easy effort, or would there be major problems in accomplishing its goal?
I think that there will be major problems, undoubtedly. Russia has the numbers. It has the ability to surround Ukraine on three sides. It has far more sophisticated weaponry and a very professional modern army. But I think that the problem is going to emerge with what comes after, and that is what to do with the occupation. I think there's every reason to believe that there would be a very costly, both in terms of human lives as well as treasure, Russian effort to try to subdue Ukraine after the invasion. NATO allies will, of course, give support to the Ukrainian insurgency, and there's going to be a domestic problem for the Putin regime of Russian soldiers killed in combat. And this is a problem, of course, for Putin, who has to deal with the prospects of running for re-election in 2024. There are going to be big problems in terms of hits to Russian international prestige, and perhaps most importantly, there will be the Western sanctions that will be imposed by the West as a stick to try to get the Russians out of Ukraine. And Russia has tried to insulate itself from Western sanctions ever since 2014. But nevertheless, given the dollarization of the global economy, given the incredible leverage that the United States and its allies had, the U.S. and its allies can put forth really crushing sanctions that would cut off global markets and capital to Russian businesses. So I think that, yes, we may consider the Russian military aggression to be, as you say, a little bit easy, but the hard part comes with the occupation.
Well, we only have about 30 seconds left here. Let me ask you, you mentioned Ukraine is not part of NATO yet, but how would an invasion affect our European allies? Would it change the dynamic in Europe there? You know, we've seen similar measures in Crimea in the past without a whole lot of difference. Would this time be different?
I think this time very much would be different. We have 3 NATO allies that border Russia right now, the Baltic states, which became NATO members at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think that a Russian invasion of Ukraine, the extension of Russian control all the way up to Western Ukraine would put those NATO countries on high alert.
Gotcha.
And people would be afraid that they might be next.
Okay. Assistant Professor Michael de Groot from Indiana University, thank you so much for putting this in perspective for us. Very well done. We appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.